John, thanks a million for doing this. What I would like to do today is to explore various aspects of the global order, the international order, which you have so eloquently written about and talked about. And the framework here really is that it is not possible to talk about the future of the global financial system without some reference to the international order of which it would be a part. I'm not going to talk so much about finance, but I would like to get the bigger picture, kind of the global setting in which financial issues can be placed. So I think the first question really is, you talk a lot about the international order. I wonder if you could describe what that means to you, and why the international order that we have today is relatively unique or totally unique in terms of other orders in history.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for doing this, and it's great to have a conversation with you about international order. I would say when we talk about international order, we're really talking about the rules and institutions of global governance, how in particular great powers organize themselves, the kinds of institutions, understandings, often informal, but nonetheless relatively durable rules of the road. And it's something that can allow one then to go back into history and look at different types of orders, the way in which the countries that rise up and become prominent in a given era shape the system, how they think about order building. And in that regard, I would argue that the U.S. has engaged in a unique kind of order building in the 20th century. The U.S. really has had three opportunities to build order in the 20th century, after the two world wars and after the Cold War. And at each moment, the U.S. was unusually fortunate to be in a position to negotiate and project its influence and establish rules, not least after World War II. And I think that's where we might begin, because the U.S. after World War II had this extraordinary opportunity. The old order had been destroyed. The 1930s was uniformly seen as a disaster, the collapse of the world economy, the ending of anything that you might call great power cooperation. So after World War II, the U.S. had this opportunity. It also had ideas. It had an agenda. It had an agenda partly driven by the lessons of 1919. The U.S. now has a second try. It can now do it again. It was in that context that the U.S. began to build international order, eventually in the shadow of the Cold War. And it did so with what I'll say big institutions and big ideas. The institutions are well known: the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions, a GATT that became the WTO, and a whole set of regional security institutions, NATO most importantly, but others as well. And so at the end of this cycle of institution building by the 1950s, we had a kind of imprinted system, an international order of a certain sort that was built around a kind of layer cake of institutions, security, political, economic institutions, some global, some regional. And the ideas, finally, were behind these big institutions, ideas about multilateralism, about democracy and the solidarity of democracy, about economic security, about new forms of political and security cooperation, the form of alliance cooperation, and so forth and so on. So there was a kind of unique moment and I think a unique outcome.
So let me ask you about a couple of aspects of that. In this notion of international order as it came out of the Second World War and at the beginning of the Cold War, what were some of the principles that were relatively, let's say, relatively new to the international order? What is it that the U.S. wanted to achieve in terms of a structure that looked different than it did in the 30s or even in the early part of the century?
Well, there were several. I think one aspect really starts with economics and starts with the attempt to make sure that after World War II we don't have a repeat of the 1930s, the Great Crisis. So many of the architects of post-World War II order were, we would call them economic determinists. That is to say, if you don't get your economics right, you aren't going to get your politics right. And so the view was very strong. It was certainly at Bretton Woods. It was in FDR's famous speech at Bretton Woods. He wasn't there, but the speech was there about the contagion of economic instability and bad decision making. So the notion I think that was new was that there needed to be multilateral frameworks that would not just be temporary to solve specific problems, but would have a kind of managerial ongoing role. So I think there was something important in that. It came out of the New Deal thinking, out of the idea that governments and business had new responsibilities and there were new imperatives for stabilization. And governments themselves were more so than certainly in the 19th century, but even more so than after World War I, seen now as new guarantors of economic and social security. And so governments needed to have an international order that would create tools and mechanisms for them to stabilize and manage and contain economic instability. A second novel aspect, I think, was on the security side as well, and that was really the use of security institutions to not simply thwart rivals that exist on the other side of the horizon, in this case the Soviet Union, but to use security institutions to manage relations among the major, we'll say, capitalist democracies, not least Japan and Germany. So finding ways to integrate these two former enemies into an open world capitalist system that would provide the benefits of integration and those very strong, what would become the second and third largest economies in the world, but also to prevent or reassure neighbors that there won't be a return to militarization. So these institutions in Europe, NATO, in Asia, the bilateral alliance system provided those kind of ongoing, I'll call them security binding tools. And then a version of that was played out in Europe itself, where Germany and France found a way to bind themselves together, the coal and steel community, and a larger set of regional institutions, and then ultimately the Atlantic system, to create this kind of trust and reassurance that would allow for the dynamics of post-war revival to take hold.
Let me focus on one word that you used, open system. I think it's fair to say that the focus on openness, by which I've heard you say in the past, access, open access. Am I right that that's at the heart of the multilateral concept, that all kinds of walls, and even the notion that one country would be able to discuss with another its economic policy, sort of the basis of the IMF. All of that is relatively new, or was relatively new, compared to orders in the past. Well, I wonder if you just talk about this whole notion of openness and rules for openness.
Yes, that's very important, I think. After World War II, there was a specific American agenda for openness, and that had to do with America's position, both its clear interest in an open trading system as the largest and most productive economy in the world, but also coming out of the 30s, but really coming out of a European era that goes back centuries of European imperial order building, which were projects of closure and exclusivity. So part of the openness that America championed openness because it had interests, economic interests and political interests, but also because it was I would say, a late arrival on the global scene, and it was arriving in a world where the Eurasian world was broken into various kinds of empires. Obviously, World War II presented a new wave of empire building in Germany and Japan, but the preceding waves of empire in Europe, which included, of course, even Britain, which had its own imperial system and commonwealth system and imperial preference system, all of these were constraints on openness and closures and spheres and blocks and zones. And so I argue that the primary driving impulse of American activism and multilateralism, which I'll get to in a moment, was this notion that America would want to be in a world where it would have access to the major regions of the world for trade and resources and diplomatic engagement. And those regions should not be, if we can help it, dominated by illiberal hegemons that are bent on closure and geopolitical rivalry. So it is a very, it's interests, it's kind of geopolitics, trying to make sure that the world, even in the 1950s, the language of the environment in which America lives, you aren't simply trying to advance your interest in an undefined world, but you're trying to create and articulate and establish a set of relationships that constitute a kind of environment in which you operate. So states in the 20th century after World War II increasingly see this as something you need to invest in. And that was driven, I think, ultimately by this notion of openness. There was this big debate during World War II in the United States about how large an access the U.S. would have to have. The term of art was the grand area. And the Council on Foreign Relations had study groups. Alvin Hansen, who was an economist at Wisconsin, later at Harvard, a Keynesian, was the spearhead of some of this thinking. How large does the grand area need to be? Can America be a great power and only exist in the Western Hemisphere? And that was the great question of the day. And the answer was no. By 1942, 43, leading thinkers in the United States really did view that America's future had to be one defined by and pursued in a global system. But paradoxically, openness also has meant organizing yourself to deal with the consequences of openness. And so we have, if you look at a kind of graph of measures of openness in the world economy and measures of international agreements that regulate openness, they go up together. So openness goes with not closure, but with managing openness. And as I said, I think that leads you to multilateralism, that you are advantaged, you and your other colleague states are advantaged if you have mechanisms to jointly manage and to have some ability to scrutinize and discipline states that might pursue policies that could bite you given contagion and spillover.
Let me ask you about another concept which is very closely related, and that's, I would call that access to join. I've heard you say that one of the features of this system is that differentiates it from the past is that it was open to anyone who would play by the rules. In other words, it was almost envisioned from the beginning as having universal potential.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk to that for just in terms of historical terms of that.
Yeah, there's the deep story of that argument that goes back to the 19th century, to the Enlightenment, to the discovery really of modernization and modernity as something that we had to understand. Adam Smith and others of that era in the late 1700s, early 1800s were conceptualizing and recognizing the world as a whole, as a single sphere, and we're beginning to think of modernity as a process that takes states and societies out of medieval and ancient forms of order into something new. And much of social science economics, sociology, political science, political theory were grappling in the 19th century with what does modernity mean and can we manage it? But it was very much a universal vision. And then, of course, in the hands of leading states, and in particular liberal states, first Britain in the 19th century, US in the 20th century, the kind of liberal understanding of the way the world works, that trade is mutually beneficial, that there are developmental processes that cut across civilizations and that can mobilize societies and lead states in particular developmental directions. All of this reinforced a notion of universalism. And I think that background kind of intellectual and political zeitgeist that evolved and came forward from the 19th century was clearly in play during the American period when, again, I think the United States saw the project of order building as potentially universal. The Cold War, of course, was a problem. There were alternatives out there, but that only in some sense sharpened the argument that the United States was purveying and trying to build a system that would have a kind of universal appeal. And then institutionally, many of these institutions were multilateral, and partly almost the definition of multilateral means that states can join in a kind of cellular nucleus that spreads out into a larger tissue of states that join together in an expanding way. So there is that kind of notion of unfolding, of being able to access these institutions. The UN, of course, is the great political example. And you have during the 20th century, during this American era of multilateralism, you have what is arguably the most important unfolding of politics in hundreds of years, and that is the spread of the nation-state system, the so-called Westphalian system. And you go from a handful of states in the late 1800s and 1900s to a true universal system of Westphalian state sovereignty, and that's happening after World War I and II, the post-colonial movements for independence, and that reinforced the sense that the world as a whole was in motion, and that there was a movement towards universal norms of sovereignty and participation enshrined in institutions that have global membership possibilities.
So you have this system which is, tell me if I've got this right, it's envisioned as being global, it's multilateral, anybody can enter it if they're willing to play by the rules. It's based on a notion of nation states being able to plug in so long as they adhere to the obligations. It's very rule-based, and it's also based on a notion that it needs to be managed. That is, that while there's a free market spirit, no one is talking about letting markets rule ungoverned. So there's a whole notion here of governance, obviously some light, some heavier, but nevertheless, right. We have almost a whole other layer of geopolitics in the management of the global economy. So, two questions here. To what extent is this kind of system unique in history? Because there have been other, de facto, there's always a system, even if it's a non-system. How unique is it? And secondly, how would you evaluate its success up to now? How would you even think about that evaluation?
Well, I think that it is unique for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. There's never been an international order this institutionalized, this global, this open. It's in that sense, looking back, the world of the great powers of the past. Read Paul Kennedy, read the great historical works on geopolitics. It's really great powers creating zones and spheres of influence and ultimately empires. And so even in 1900, the world of 1900 was a world where most people in the world lived inside of empires, either on the top or the bottom, mostly on the bottom. And so the idea of a global order that has these two new dimensions, that is to say, sovereignty that's spread out among all the states in a system that now has almost 200 nation states, and this kind of liberal internationalism, which directs politics towards institutionalized cooperation, openness, and at least loosely rule-based order. So I think that it's very difficult to see anything in the past that resembles it. It's much more of a system that allows for access and flows and mutual governance. It's not a utopia. There's a lot of power, and the U.S. has privileges and rights, and it has used its power to project its ideas into various parts of the world, and has obviously dominated weaker societies, and it's in the Western Hemisphere and elsewhere. But I think it does have this more consensual and negotiated order character to it that makes it unique. Its accomplishments. Well, I think there are a set of accomplishments you could point to. I think number one, the opening of the world economy after World War II was a major accomplishment, and it required bargaining and rules and leadership and reciprocal deals that had to be undergirded by institutions and norms of reciprocity in the tariff area in particular initially. So opening the world economy, but doing so in a new way that allowed for reluctant states to become parties, to provide tools for management of openness, what some people call embedded liberalism, that is to say, finding tools, the IMF perhaps being the best example, where international capacities that states can draw upon when they are in distress. A second accomplishment, I think, is the reintegration of Germany and Japan, extraordinary in world history, thinking about two major states that were clearly revisionist imperial states that were seeking a very different kind of world order, were almost overnight turned into partners and turned into major stakeholders in an open system. The solving of the German-French problem, I think it's a kind of quiet revolution in world politics, the way France decided the best way to deal with a rival Germany was to love it to death, to embrace it in some sense through various institutions and engagements. The way in which this system provided opportunities for various kinds of states that were on at least we'll call it maybe the semi-periphery to make political and economic transitions. You think of Asia, it's Japan being the great example, of course, but South Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand, and then later Indonesia, various countries making various kinds of political and economic transitions through trade-oriented reforms and growth models. It also, of course, it goes back to this question of the opportunities for countries to join in to become stakeholders in this system. Obviously, the Eastern Europeans, Central Europeans after the Cold War, and Southern Europeans, and through the European Community, and other countries making various kinds of reforms. Not always easy, and not always with the most enlightened guidance and support by the core states, European and American. There's a story there to tell, but nonetheless, I would code that as an accomplishment. The final accomplishment, I think, would be peacefully ending the Cold War. And that's a story really about how the West both outperformed the Soviet Union, but also was, in some sense, sufficiently stable and defensively oriented to allow Gorbachev to make big bets that reform and some kind of engagement, starting with nuclear weapons and a kind of mutual partnership for stabilizing and bringing down nuclear weapon levels, would be a path that the Soviet and then Russia could take. That hasn't turned out as we had hoped, but the end of the Cold War peacefully, I think, has to be partly chalked up to this paradoxical Western system that was both exceedingly dynamic, that could keep these various very robust great powers, all of them liberal democracies in Europe and Asia and North America, together enough to cooperate and perform at a level that they could really be the dominant core of a system that the Soviet Union had to reconcile itself with.
Would you say that in addition to the factors you cited, or in addition to the way you evaluated accomplishments, there is another one which is, I guess, lack of a better term, I would call just the expansion of material welfare and prosperity. That is, that in most of the world, in this order, under this order, there was an attempt to focus on economic progress. Didn't always happen. Wars got in the way, political conflict got in the way. But if you went to virtually all countries, the focus was really economic welfare. And this system allowed for that and implicitly kind of emphasized that, even though it was only a small, not the whole thing.
I think that's right. I think that's in some sense the pursuit of that opportunity what drove a great deal of the transitions that I suggested were occurring in Asia and elsewhere, and even in the Soviet Union as it looked for alternatives. This is clearly what the economic story is, the underbelly, so to speak, of the political accomplishments and the kind of structures that were sufficiently durable and expansive at the political level.
So let me ask you now about another sort of really big topic. This is looking forward, and that is threats to the system. And there's no particular order, but I would like to maybe just start with China, since that's on everybody's mind. One of the major changes since the founding of this order really has been the rise of China. How do you think about, let me say, China, and maybe China as a surrogate for other big emerging markets as a challenge? I know there are other issues, but I want to just start with that one.
Yeah, I think that is the big question, and one could imagine a future where China and other non-Western developing countries want to go a different direction. And some people make this argument that the end of the American era, or the post-American hegemonic era, will be dominated by states pursuing a different agenda of one kind or another. And so that's out there as a possibility. Starting with China, I've been of the view that China is not deeply antagonistic to we'll call the underlying principles of the existing order, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that. First of all, China as a rising state faces not freedom of choice. It doesn't have, in some sense, the opportunities the United States had. The U.S. was able to do what it did in the world in the 20th century partly because it stepped forward after major wars that had destroyed the old order. And short of that sort of catastrophe, China will be dealing with an order that's up and running, that has constituencies, that has institutions that are deeply embedded in countries around the world. So in that sense, China faces a different kind of order than past rising states. So I would start with the first point, which is it's going to be difficult to look at history and project the pattern of the rising state of the past into the China case, partly because I think China faces a much more formidable order, and I've argued it's an order that's easy to join and hard to overturn. Easy to join for the reasons we've mentioned earlier, that there are opportunities to trade and become stakeholders institutionally. China already, of course, is more there than we appreciate. It's a member of the Security Council, permanent member of the Security Council, and it's in all these different international institutions. It's ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty, which the United States hasn't. So in many ways, it's tied itself to the regimes and institutions of the global system, and that is really testimony to the pervasiveness of that set of complex institutions that are in China's environment. Another reason why I think China is more of a evolutionary player in the system is that this order we've been describing has lots of different varieties of political economy in it. It's more pluralistic than what often is described as the Washington consensus version of the order. There are at least two other models of political economy in this order. One would be a kind of social democratic European model, and a third version and type would be what we often call the Asian state-led industrial model of Korea and Japan. And indeed, when China was making its reform decisions under Deng Xiaoping, at least part of what China was looking at was what its Asian neighbors were doing in their various ways in which a technocratic, bureaucratic elite was operating in the context of long-term development goals to mobilize and engage in trade-oriented development. So China is not so out of the ideologically, not necessarily out of the picture. It can find a place in that order as well. A couple other points that also lead to the same basic bottom line. One is that we've talked about openness. China thrives on openness, and that's why we're talking about China today, because they've taken advantage of it and trade and invested their way. And now there's China entering a phase of foreign direct investment, and we see an evolution of China's role in the world economy. So this is what has brought them to where they are, and having access to other societies and being in an open system is clearly in its interest. And then rules. We've talked about multilateralism. Rising states that are acquiring wealth and economic capabilities are states that need rules, if for no other reason to protect their equities, to protect them against arbitrary and indiscriminate protectionism and other kinds of behaviors. So this, after all, is what the West, why the Western states really ultimately bought into rule of law kind of institutions, both inside of countries and around the Western core, as ways to protect your property rights and your gains, so to speak. And so too, China has an incentive for that as it becomes more of a beneficiary and stakeholder and equity holder, so to speak, in the system. So I think there are reasons why it's better to see China as a rising state that wants to keep an international environment of a certain sort that will allow it to continue to do what it's doing, which is growing and continuing to solve developmental problems which are only becoming more difficult, and that leads us to more of a kind of bargain kind of environment with the outside world. One final point: China facing this American-led order. We've been describing that order today. One aspect of that order, after you have the other aspects, which include openness and multilateralism and so forth, is American hegemonic leadership. And and it is true that at the level of leadership of the system, China is seeking more voice and more authority. And there will be difficult struggles ahead over how to share authority in these great institutions. And so it's not to minimize the kind of struggle, but I'm suggesting the struggle is not really struggle over the deep principles of order, whether it should be relatively open and relatively multilateral, but struggles over the distribution of authority. Yes, those are there. They're already there. But those are ones that can be negotiated. They're not either or, black and white. It's either a Chinese order or an American order. They're more questions about how we reform and expand the structures.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you about a second kind of threat to the order, which I draw from your extensive writings and your talks, and that is the threat that would come or hypothetically come from a diminished capacity of the United States to lead. And when I say diminished capacity, obviously it's a big subject, but I'm including at least two things. One is at least a perception of inadequate resources as shared internationally and domestically, that we've got to focus much more at home, and the other a kind of political dysfunction that prohibits the government from leading, and not necessarily because it doesn't want to, but because it simply can't get a consensus. How much of a threat is that bag of issues to the order that now exists?
Yeah, I think those are threats, and in some sense, the premise behind that question is that perhaps the greatest threat to the order comes from the U.S. itself. The U.S. The future of the order depends a great deal on the United States. It can act in a way or fail to act that could create instabilities and make other states make strategic choices to look elsewhere for order. And so I do accept that as a basic premise, that I worry about the United States' ability to think about its role in the world in this kind of expansive way as a provider of security and public goods, and a leader ideologically, and in terms of exercising power to stabilize and manage and run the system. And so I think that those are challenges. One of the strange qualities of the existing order is that the U.S. after World War II came to play this hegemonic role. The dollar became the global currency. The American military, in some sense, became the capacity for providing security in major parts of the world. So America kind of became fused to the global order, and its own system became part of the global system. Countries, in some sense, contracted out to the United States to help provide services of governance of one kind or another. You can think about it in those terms. So is the United States going to be able to do that, and do that when most Americans don't really see America in that role? They see America as a regular country, very powerful for sure, but with its own agenda and its own domestic problems. So they don't necessarily see the U.S. as a system stabilizer. And I think that is a problem, a kind of disconnect, a kind of American internationalism is built on stilts, in a sense, that it's not deeply embedded in the American political system and knowledge by American citizens of the special role that the U.S. plays. So I think that that's something to worry about. The other aspect of your question really is, does the larger system need the United States? And here I would say that I waffle a little bit on this question. Theoretically, my academic work suggests that it's conceivable that a larger coalition of states can do what the United States has done. we call it a kind of concert of states, a great power consortium. And to some extent that is being done. The so-called G process is a way of developing informal diplomatic and summitry-based leadership coalitions. And that, I think we have to push that harder going forward, because that's going to be where a lot of the shared burden of leadership will come from. But I think there's been a little bit of worry that's crept into our foreign policy decision makers in Washington, that maybe the transition to a kind of multi-partnership global order is not going so well, that countries are not necessarily stepping up, and the U.S. may not be fully establishing a kind of follow-on governance mechanism that will operate. And I think that's something to worry about.
So let me ask you about a third hypothetical threat, and that is, I call it geopolitical tension or geopolitical struggles. So we have a situation where obviously the Middle East is really being torn asunder. We have Russia in a very tense situation in Central Europe. And we have a lot of tension which could get out of hand in Asia, revolving around territorial disputes, which almost it's a word that doesn't quite do justice to the potentially explosive nature. To what degree does the order that we have now depend on harnessing or constraining these tensions, and to what extent do you think the order is vulnerable to much more political strife around the world?
That's a very big topic with a lot of aspects, and I think that the world is kind of in a new phase of instability, obviously in the Middle East, as you suggest, and in Ukraine. Russia as a much more aggrieved and aggressive stance towards its near abroad, and there, as you say, there's China with its own kind of growing assertiveness in maritime and island territorial disputes. The first thing I would say is part of the one should not, and although we have it's tempting to kind of aggregate this into a global condition that is assaulting the world order. So I have been one to say, calm down a little bit and kind of let's look at these different components and see what's going on. And part of what's going on, certainly let's start with Russia, is that it's really Russian weakness, and it's the success of the European project, and one might say the NATO project of providing platforms for states that have been on the periphery of Europe to integrate and thrive. Think of how Poland has thrived as a member of this Western club, so to speak, and Ukraine has not. Its GNP has tripled during the period that Ukraine's has stagnated, even though they started at a similar level. So there are part of the instability is we'll call it the crises of success of the dynamic aspects of this order that has put illiberal states and those that worry about the future of their regime on the defensive. Think about both Beijing and Moscow as regimes that worry about regime change. They worry that the ideas that are very robust in this wider liberal world order are going to foment opposition and even political regime change at home. And so part of the behavior of these illiberal great powers is driven by insecurity and the overall unfavorable shift in the balance of forces, we'll call them. China and Russia don't have a brand. They don't have big ideas. They're bereft of really alternative ideas, and the basis of their legitimacy is a very weak basis with a fragile foundation. Now, the Middle East is a third area, and that has its own logic, and that really is a story of the breakdown of an American-led client-based order that it too perhaps started with social movements, the so-called Arab Spring, that was a kind of credit to the social forces that were available and able to be unleashed by the modernizing system, social media and so forth. But I don't think we have solutions to that region, and I don't think necessarily the U.S. has that the core global order depends on having solutions. I think in some sense there are no solutions. There's containment, there's management, there's attempting to find frameworks that can stabilize and push back on the worst extremism that exists in the region, but that doesn't necessarily speak to whether the larger global system, the world economy, will lose its bearings and its foundations or not. I think that what we can do, there is so much uncertainty about the future. There's a great deal of uncertainty about how various pieces of the puzzle fit together. That's for sure, and we're only learning about spillover effects and contagion effects, and indeed when we look at the United States, the big question is really, do allies and partners in one part of the world look at the United States in what it's doing in other parts of the world? Do you draw lessons in Taiwan for what is happening in Ukraine, for example, or American reluctance to play the policeman role in Syria? Does that have implications for how allies in Asia respond? So one needs to be attuned to those kinds of dynamics and look for the kind of incipient problems. I come back to answer your question to a kind of formulation of the best way to prepare for and respond to those crises, whether it's belligerence from Russia or assertiveness from China or the disarray in the Middle East, is to keep an eye on strengthening the relations among the liberal democratic states, the old core and the newer states. That for me, the great question and the great challenge is to make sure that a whole set of countries that are rising up, that are not in the headlines because they're not in crisis, but I think of them as the middle class of states that are all capitalist and all democratic, even if some of them are struggling in their democracy, from India to Brazil to Indonesia to Turkey to Mexico and on and on. South Korea is a great example of a country that is a player in the system in a way it wasn't in the past. These are the states that are important to cultivate, to reach out to find ways to work with them on problem solving, to ideologically work on some of the old grievances, often ideological grievances, particularly for countries that have emerged out of colonial and imperial histories, India, Brazil among them, that there are chips on your shoulder, there are unresolved historical issues, and I think the United States and the West more generally, in trying to build a bigger tent and to create the kind of critical mass that can be the stabilizer for a world that is going to go through these transitions in great power conflict and Middle Eastern conflict, that if that core can be, the more gravitas and scale and scope of that core, the better, because it means the overall forces of stability are greater than the forces of instability, and that will determine who wins in the end, chaos or order.
Well, that's a great way to look at it. And let me conclude. I'm going to ask you just one other question, but I think I know the answer based on what you've said. But one of the things that is characterizing the international system, I believe, is we are seeing more sort of global type crises. And I'm not thinking so much about the security side, because I think you did a very good job of basically separating, the various kinds of instability. But, we had a financial crisis that basically envelops just about the whole world. We're having let's call it a epidemic moment, which may not now create a global epidemic, but there certainly is in the air that we have that possibility. When you think about the internet, and let's say both the positive and the negative, the possibilities of cyber terrorism, you now have these global crises that require real global responses.
Right.
I think from what you're saying that you would say, actually, this is, as serious as these are, this is an opportunity to strengthen the global order that we have. That, in fact, this order is set up for that by its multilateralism, its openness, its focus on mutual collaboration, its invitation for everyone to join in sort of group solutions. Even the growth of what you called the G factor, the G10, the G20, whatever.
Yeah.
That on balance, you would probably be optimistic that these are not threats to the global order. They, in fact, justify the kind of global order we have. And if we're not totally crazy, we will be able to strengthen the order around these. Would I have that right?
Yes, you do. When you were talking, I was thinking of it in the following sense that John Dewey, who wrote about democracy, made the argument that democracies were sort of laboratories for learning and problem solving. And so you would expect them to evolve in different ways, and indeed you set up democracy partly because you know that the problems of tomorrow will be different, and you need to have mechanisms in place, in this case accountable government and participation of citizens to tackle those problems that are inevitable. And so too, one could argue, using the kind of Dewey perspective, that liberal internationalism and the kind of multilateral system is a kind of, should best be seen as a kind of laboratory for problem solving and for developing and implementing new kinds of cooperation initiatives aimed at solving the problems of the day. And so that's in some sense the ultimate point. Think about the order that we've been talking about today, the post-war order, the way in which it emerged. It was aimed at solving problems that were unique to that period, but also problems that were driven by deeper forces that are with us today. We'll call them the rising economic and security interdependence, that we now live and then lived in a world where increasingly what other people did or didn't do or what nature did would be relevant to our own health and security and well-being. And so you had to reach out and look for cooperative solutions. So under conditions of rising economic and security interdependence, the advantages of cooperation grow relative to the costs of having to make costly commitments to bind yourself to international agreements. So the gains grow relative to the constraints on your action. And so if that basic insight is right, then we need to push for these basic formulas of problem solving that whether it's health pandemics, financial crises, global warming, a kind of slow motion problem that is emerging. These are all problems that, if you will, you cannot solve them as a nation alone. You can only solve them together, and that is a prescription for a future that facilitates ever more complex forms of cooperation. I'm not necessarily optimistic that we will generate that greater complex cooperation. I am certain that the incentives for doing so will be there, and the ideas and the experiences of the past 50, 60 years will help in the politics of trying to get there.
John, I think that's a great place to stop. I could talk to you all day. Just want to thank you for really covering a huge amount of issues in a very, very thoughtful way. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.